Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where we've just heard a panel discussion that was constituted the launch of the Global Peace Index for this year, put together by Vision for Humanity. And we have with us Lana Baydas, who is a researcher here for the Human Rights Initiative at CSIS. Lana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having this conversation.
It's a pleasure. I want to ask you, we heard from Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the executive director for Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch, very, very passionate defender for an organization that promotes human rights worldwide. You two look at human rights worldwide here at CSIS, and your focus is in the Middle East and North Africa as well. From your standpoint, what were your takeaways from the report that just came out that grades nations on their human rights records? The United States comes out, I think, at 114. Iceland was at the top of the list. From your standpoint, what are the key takeaways from the report?
Actually, the key take of the reports mainly are the driver for a positive peace. If we look at the Middle East and North Africa, they've been categorized as the least peaceful region. That tells us a lot about what are the problems, mainly that in terms of a human rights situation, which is deteriorating, and you see lack of connectivity between the needs of the citizens and the individual in the countries and their leadership. So you feel as well you have not well-functioning governments, lack of trust between the individuals in the country and their leadership, as well as there's a violation of human rights and individual rights. Freedom of expression has been curtailed, freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly. That not to talk about the economic and social rights that not been integrated in the policy of government of ensuring that all these rights are protected.
So what's, from a U.S. strategic perspective, what from your standpoint is the best way to balance U.S. support for human rights, for democracy, for freedom, and its role as a global superpower that has allies on which it depends, but that those allies have their own agenda? Saudi Arabia has been a number one proliferator of Wahhabism and intolerant Islam around the world. Qatar has been the same to a degree, so is the UAE. But each of these are also critical strategic partners for the United States in the region, both to counter Iran, but also for the preservation of regional security. What's the balance for a U.S. superpower strategy in that part of the world, even if we don't like, for example, what the Saudis are doing in Yemen, for example?
Definitely, there is no competition between human rights and security, and this is an important thing that will be coming across in the messages coming from the U.S. Human rights of all individuals in the world, and this is the values that core values of the U.S., and this is where we need to continue pushing forward. In our fighting in the U.S. fight against terrorism, this is the kind of messages that needs to be mentioned to all our partners, strategic partners, looking at counterterrorism is not a pretext to violate human rights. And this is where the whole, I think, a holistic strategy should be coming out from the U.S. as a superpower, where this strategy been built and entrenched on human rights and based on human rights, and working with various actors, various stakeholders. It's not only with governments. We need to look at the civil society, and this is where we see the most attacks coming in the Middle East and North Africa against civil society. And without a civic space protected and based on the rule of law and democracy, we would not be able to feel secure in the country. The civil society has an active role in countering the violent extremism. They work with the local communities. They manage to have across certain messages and to engage with them in different services that could be a medium for any grievances.
Do you sense, from your standpoint, does the United States hurt itself by being, as some would argue, realpolitik, but just saying like, look, our allies have their interests, we have our interests. If they need to take strong measures, that's up to them. Do you consider that to be a strategic mistake for the United States? Does that backfire? I mean, your personal history, you Palestinian parents who are from Jaffa, you were born in Lebanon and raised in the region. Does that have a resonance to you? Does it hurt the United States ultimately if it doesn't promote a human rights agenda?
Human rights is an important agenda, and this is where we see in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa, that's needed, and we need to strengthen that. Otherwise, we will be stuck in continuous cycle of violence. Without coming this from the U.S., without having this backup, and if you look at the history, civil society and the human rights activists look at the U.S. for support. There are a number of interventions coming from the U.S. to ensure the release of a human rights activist, and this is something that needs to be continuing. In terms of a strategic mistake, I wouldn't like to comment on this in particular, whether it's a mistake and what's the overall, but again, it's without having a peaceful society, and society built on democratic values, on the rule of law, that will have a worldwide domino effects that will be spreading around in different directions, be it in all form of radicalization. We will see it in being a society alienated, opening up a channel and being used as a medium for the growth of these violent extremism.
What's the way to create these democratic governments? If you look at the Gulf kingdoms, they're all kingdoms. If you look at the situation in Egypt, it had a brief flirtation with democracy, but then that backfired because many Egyptians were uncomfortable with what Morsi did, which is why they supported Sisi returning to power. Lebanon is as close to a democracy as you can find in the region, but then it has its own peculiarities about how it runs. What's the key to foster those? Jordan is stable, but it also is a monarchy. You could argue somewhat more representational because it has a parliament to a degree that functions. But tell us, and Syria is, of course, where it is. Iraq is still struggling. I would say Iraq is also a democratic country, but it also faces corruption and a whole series of challenges, not to sell Iraq short in its challenges. But, tell us what's the key to be able to drive this democratic revolution that I think that everybody ultimately says, okay, is necessary, but how do you do that?
It should be first and foremost, and in our foreign policy engagement should be consistent. Human rights goes in hand in the economic and security interests of the United States, should not be separated or putting in competition, that's for sure. And our interaction with governments needs to look at the different forms of constitution, laws, and not only on what's written in the law, and as well as what's been implemented. Looking at the law enforcement agencies, how much that they working in consistence with these letters been prescribed in the constitutions and the law. And this is something that we've seen that certain interventions been taken by the U.S. government and in various administration, but it should be consistent. It's just not we came up with the constitution that's wonderful, but then we need to follow up on be consistent and looking at the whole implementation processes, corruption, looking at the rule of law, etc.
Lana, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on this.